11 years ago, CD Projekt Red put out a teaser trailer for Cyberpunk 2077. It was completely pre-rendered of course, but despite the lack of gameplay, it impressed, and it gave us a tantalizing glimpse of what the final game might be like. However, that trailer ended with what would become an unfortunate declaration. I played Cyberpunk back at launch on the PS4 Pro, and although I didn't experience the full last-gen horror show, this clearly was not the best time or the best platform to play it on. During my playthrough, I was constantly being pulled out of the experience, or straight up being prevented from progressing by bugs and performance issues. So I stopped playing after a few hours and decided to wait for some patches to roll out. I jumped back in every time a major update shipped to see what had changed, and although these patches would eventually fix many of the issues, playing it sporadically meant that after a while I had no idea what was going on. In spite of this less than amazing first impression, the idea of an immersive first-person action RPG set against a dystopian cyberpunk backdrop still ticked a lot of boxes for me. So, on the advice of a friend, I started a new game about a month back to give it one last chance, honestly not expecting much. Turns out, Cyberpunk 2077 is a hugely impressive, immersive, captivating, enchanting, and plenty of other superlatives as well. This is not the same broken shit show that launched 4 years ago. So in this re-review, I want to discuss how it's evolved over time, what it's like to play in its current and final form, the issues that remain because yes, perfectly optimized this is not, and if it is in fact finally ready. Okay, before we get started, I wanted to let you know how I played through it, because you have a lot of options and this can dramatically alter the type of experience you have. So I played through on the PS5 and I chose the performance mode, which aims for 60 frames per second and a resolution that scales up to 1800p. And I'll talk about why I chose this mode and what your other choices are later in the video. Also, in the last couple of re-reviews, I've covered the paid DLC. I won't be doing that here because Cyberpunk is already a big game and this video is already long enough. Additionally, it's pretty clear based on my previous re-reviews that most people don't want to see the DLC stuff before playing the main game. One final thing, a handful of my gameplay clips are slightly cropped. I have a new editing rig and a new capture card and honestly, I don't know what I did in OBS. It's not horrendous, I just thought I'd give you a heads up. Okay, with that out of the way, let's get into the updates. Cyberpunk 2077 has a long and storied update history. In the interest of brevity, I'm going to focus on the major updates and what the key improvements were. If you have a spare weekend and want to read through all of them, I've left a link in the description. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the early updates focused on bug fixes and stability. It wasn't until around patch 1.3 that the game started to see some new content, but arguably patch 1.5 is the first big one in terms of pushing the game forward. This was a massive update, and it's the patch that added native support for the PS5 and also the Xbox Series machines. It rebalanced the economy and loot systems, added new apartments, and made various visual improvements. This is also where we start seeing the last-gen machines getting properly left behind when talking about features and content. Patch 1.6 coincided with the Netflix series Edgerunners, which is worth a watch by the way. This was another decent-sized update that added new weapons, perks, and quests, along with a myriad of other fixes and improvements such as uplifting the UI and new wardrobe functionality. Additionally, there was some equipment and secrets that tied directly into the Netflix show. This would be the final update for last-gen machines, with all future patches targeting the more powerful platforms. Patch 2.0 was the biggest update of the lot. This coincided with the Phantom Liberty DLC and included many long overdue features, such as a police system and some actual AI to go along with the A for NPCs and traffic. On top of this, there were some big changes to how the perk trees functioned, as well as a bunch of new stuff to flesh out the world, like minigames. This update is so significant that the patch notes actually recommend starting a new game to get the best experience. The final major update was 2.1. This again added new content, new ways to interact with your romantic partners, the Porsche 911 Cabriolet, and replayable car races. Some of the boss encounters were modified to make them more interesting too, and in some instances more reactive to your current loadout. Probably the most significant component of this update in terms of content is a functioning metro system. You can use this for fast travel or just to take in the sights. Now, the game did receive a hotfix after this, and it could potentially receive smaller fixes in the future. As far as adding new content and making improvements though, CD Projekt Red considers the game done and has moved on to other projects. So it should go without saying that updating to the latest version on whichever platform you choose to play it on is an absolute must. The game ran like complete arse at launch and has received so many improvements across every component that it's a very different beast now. It also makes a lot of sense to play it on current gen consoles or a beefy PC. Last gen machines are in a better place than at launch for sure, but Cyberpunk 2077 was clearly never meant to run on the older hardware, and this is evident by the numerous features and improvements that weren't implemented on last gen. Okay, so on the topic of last gen, how bad is the state of things on the older machines? The worst of the last gen platforms when talking about performance and display resolution is unsurprisingly the Xbox One, which has a resolution that scales up to a maximum of 810p. The base PS4 is marginally better with a 900p max resolution. The PS4 Pro is a step up again at 1188p, and finally the One X is the best of the lot, with a 1674p maximum resolution. All four systems are capped at 30 frames per second, and both the base models really struggle to hit that. I don't have a last gen machine to get any real side-by-side comparisons, but I was able to run the PS4 version on a PS5 through backwards compatibility. Now, the PS4 version on a PS5 actually runs at 60 frames per second, and has a slightly higher resolution than the PS4 Pro. And yeah, while the performance and visuals on display here are well beyond what the PS4 and the PS4 Pro could ever hope to achieve, what these comparisons do demonstrate are the visual differences. From the lower quality textures, dramatically reduced traffic and NPC density, to the missing visual effects. The most jarring difference is just how slowly some assets and textures take to load. Sometimes they never load correctly, and things like pedestrians pop in and out of view constantly. Remember, this is running on a PS5 with significantly more processing power and memory. On an actual PS4 or Pro, or God forbid a VCR, this will be noticeably worse, and it runs at a lower resolution and frame rate. What these brief side-by-side comparisons don't adequately communicate is the number of missing features or how brain-dead the AI is. All of the cutbacks have created this negative compounding effect, and it becomes glaringly obvious when driving around how stripped back this version of the game is. It just feels dead and lifeless. While the visual quality and, to a degree, the performance is better on the Pro and One X, all of the last-gen versions of Night City feel like pale facsimiles of the PC and current-gen versions. Okay, so on that note, let's talk about what it's like to play, because I think that the visual downgrades and missing features aren't the main reasons that playing on last gen should be avoided. The biggest issue is the frame rate. Playing at 60 frames per second feels infinitely better than 30. At 30, the controls aren't smooth or responsive, and if I had to pick a word to describe what it feels like to play at 30, it would be crunchy. I can't understate how bad this game feels at 30 frames per second. I thought maybe it was a last gen thing, but no. A quick tour on the quality mode on the PS5 reveals just how awful and imprecise it feels, especially the gunplay. Seriously, if you plan on playing it and you have the ability to play at 60, do yourself a favour. On current gen consoles, you can choose between the performance or quality modes. Performance aims for 60 frames per second, which outside of driving it hits most of the time. This mode has a resolution that scales up to 1800p. It previously scaled up to 4K, but this number was reduced in the 2.0 patch to improve performance and image quality. It'll definitely be interesting to see if it gets a PS5 Pro patch if and when that hardware arrives to restore 4K output. The quality mode on the other hand caps the frame rate at 30 frames per second, but adds in ray trace shadows and higher quality screen space reflections. It has a resolution that, according to Digital Foundry, is capped at 1440p. So yeah, you get your frame rate chopped in half and a lower display resolution than in the performance mode. I don't know, I don't think there's enough visual improvement here to justify playing it at 30. Even in the areas where you can see a noticeable difference, the visuals don't exactly melt your face off, and it does look a fraction softer. Each to their own of course, but if you've really got to have a frame rate above 30 and ray tracing, then PC is the answer. PC gets additional visual effects such as ray traced reflections and can output a native 4K image at 60 frames per second, so long as you have the hardware that can manage it. You get far more granular control over the performance and visual settings too, and the results are more dramatic. I should probably mention Xbox Series X as well. It unfortunately doesn't include ray tracing, but it did receive a couple of graphics modes. A performance mode, which has a resolution that scales up to 1080p at 60 frames per second, was added in the 1.6 update. This is in addition to the existing quality mode, which aims for 30 frames per second at up to 1440p. Series S is considered next-gen, so it got all of the same content and feature updates that the PS5 and Series X did. Let's move on to gameplay. What struck me the most while playing through it this time was how just about all of its components felt enjoyable, and how cohesive the whole thing is. Back in 2020, a lot of systems felt half-baked, and plenty of others like the combat, while complete, were simply serviceable. They worked, but they weren't activities I looked forward to engaging in. I originally set out to focus on the main story missions, factoring in the occasional side quests so that I could finish the game in around 30 hours. Turns out that I am way more distractible than I realized, and I spent almost as much time checking out shiny bright objects. Moving around the world and interacting with stuff just works now, and there's heaps of opportunities to get distracted from the main storyline. New content like cars and the transit system are nice additions for sure, but it's the simple things like having a police system and NPCs that don't act like lemmings that have made the world seem more alive. Walking around, you're likely to notice people engaged in conversation and activities, and each environment has plenty of details to explore. The combat is actually fun now. Okay, sure, the hand-to-hand stuff is sometimes a little janky, but using weapons like the katana and the mantis blades makes you feel like a badass, and I think the gunplay is well executed too. It's not as tight feeling as a competitive shooter, but experimenting and upgrading weapons is addictive, and they all look and sound fantastic. Again, this is all dependent on playing it at 60 frames per second. Car handling is still fairly unforgiving. Most vehicles have almost no grip when turning into a corner, and operate like a shopping trolley full of sandbags. Although it's fundamentally better than it was. Some of the vehicles added post-launch are a lot of fun too, especially the weaponized ones. When the game launched, NPC behavior was about as convincing as Rook from Romulus. They just walked around bumping into things and not really reacting to the world around them. I wouldn't say that they set a new standard for crowd AI, and it's possible to hear the same conversations repeated over and over again, but critically, they don't feel like placeholders anymore. Now, if you're not a regular to my channel, you're probably unaware that I've made a couple of videos on Cyberpunk that break down the UI. As a UI designer, that's right, I have a real job, I've never enjoyed using Cyberpunk's various menus. There's so much embellishment, and you have to learn so many different systems, which makes the learning curve steep, and it unintentionally obfuscates many of its systems. Thankfully, the UI has seen numerous improvements over the years. The biggest uplift, in my opinion, was to the skill trees. This used to be a nightmare to understand and navigate, with shit placed all over the screen. There was basically no hierarchy. This has been completely overhauled to have a more meaningful impact on your character's attributes and abilities. CD Projekt Red even made a build planner to help you learn how this system works that you can access from a web browser. I actually kind of ignored this area of the game back in 2020 because of how convoluted it was, whereas now I find it an addictive part of progression. There are other, more subtle changes throughout the UI, such as the improvements made to the map, and this has resulted in a more accessible experience overall. I mean this both in terms of letting people with a disability play, but also just in general. Navigating the game's menus and accessing information is a lot better than it used to be. It's not fixed, mind you, I constantly forget how to add quick hacks to my cyberware, for example, but generally speaking, I think it strikes a much better signal-to-noise ratio. Shout out to all my designer peeps who understand what the fuck I'm talking about. Collectively, these improvements have transformed, radically in some cases, what it's like to play. Night City and its numerous distractions is truly something to behold now. It doesn't just feel like smoke and mirrors anymore, and when you layer on top things like the character and weapon customization and massive amounts of choice that impact the story, I think it sets the bar very high for this type of game. In spite of all the improvements though, and how impressive Cyberpunk's redemption arc has been, it's not without jank. Yeah, there's still a lot of it. I think most of it can be chalked up to typical open world shenanigans that you'll find in a lot of these games. Even still, it doesn't feel as polished as you'd expect. To be clear, most of the bugs I encountered were visual, meaning that although distracting, they didn't prevent me from playing the game. I did experience a handful of game-breaking issues though, such as an instance where an NPC failed to load, requiring me to restart the mission, and I had a hard crash too. But generally speaking, the bugs reported at launch appear to be dramatically reduced. At least they were in the 40-something hours it took me to play through it. I reckon spending more time with the game is likely to reveal more and potentially worse bugs, although where it's currently at is very playable. Just be aware that problems like this is something you'll encounter, and it definitely feels like the game could benefit from one final patch. Right, so I wanted to briefly touch on the expansion, and to be clear, I'm not going to discuss the story. I'm just going to cover what's included, and I promise there won't be spoilers of any kind. Phantom Liberty is the first and only expansion, and it's pretty substantial. It adds a new storyline, new characters, new mission types, vehicles, weapons, a new skill tree, and a new district, which you can actually visit even if you haven't paid for the DLC, you just can't access it. Although Phantom Liberty is kind of a standalone story, you can't play it without owning the main game. And if you're using an existing save, you'll need to have completed the transmission quest in Act 2 before you can start it. There's a ton of reviews out there for this, and both critics and players alike seem to universally love it. It has a mighty rating on OpenCritic and a very positive rating on Steam. It's not cheap at $45 Australian or roughly $30 US, so I'd recommend waiting for a sale, but I definitely plan on hitting it up sometime soon.
New fingerprints detected.
The fuck?
Increasing volume by 33%. New fingerprints detected.
What the hell are you?
User inquiry. Technical specifications. HJKE11 smart gun with built-in AI. Experimental model. Name. Skippy.
Cyberpunk 2077 is a very different game to what came out in 2020, and in my opinion, a truly phenomenal experience. I think the themes of capitalism, corruption, and sentient AI are even more relevant today, and it absolutely delivers on the cyberpunk fantasy pitched in that trailer 11 years ago. It still has way more technical issues than a AAA title should, and I think for some people this might be a turnoff. For this reason, I totally understand why you might have no interest in giving it another chance. It should never have shipped in the unfinished state that it did, and it should never have been ported to the last-gen machines either. Not because people on last-gen don't deserve to play it, but simply because the older hardware was never realistically going to be able to run it properly. Let me repeat this if it wasn't obvious already. I strongly recommend avoiding the last-gen versions. Yes, things have improved a lot since launch, but it's still in a pretty bad state. The performance issues heavily detract from the experience, but more importantly, the game has evolved so much since that final last-gen update that it just doesn't hold up compared to the other versions. And if you don't believe me, both the Xbox and PlayStation stores point out that the experience on the older systems will be subpar, with Sony essentially telling you not to play it on the base PS4. Last-gen versions aside though, if you've been on the fence until now and were waiting for it to reach a point of being finished, then I think it mostly is. Night City feels like an actual place with interesting characters, stories, and activities to discover, and it will keep you coming back again and again. It may have taken 4 years to get to this point, technically 11 if you count from that first trailer, but Cyberpunk is very much worth your time now, and it's easily the best game I've played this year.